A very kind lady approached me before this meeting this evening and she thanked me for being here. Let me just say that I require or deserve no thanks for being here this evening. On the contrary, it's my absolute duty to be at this meeting this evening, and if it had been so required, I would have walked all the way from Scotland to get here. I'm very proud and privileged to be part of a very esteemed panel of not only intellectual heavyweights, but more importantly, moral heavyweights. I'd like to pay special tribute to Laurie and Tommy, who remind us that this is not a parlour game, that there are human consequences. But though there are human consequences for resisting this juggernaut, the consequences of passivity are far, far greater. Just take a look at how diverse this panel is. The diversity of this panel this evening is testament to the unifying power of human consciousness when engaged in a struggle for a just cause. Chris Hedges, I'm especially delighted to see you here this evening. You are one of the few people who, when you see their name attached to a political campaign, you automatically know that it is worthy of support. Your work, of which I am very familiar, stands as testament to the sagacity enshrined in words attributed to the Greek Roman historian Plutarch, namely that education is the kindling of a flame, not the filling of a vessel. Let me start by stating the obvious. Julian Assange is languishing in Belmarsh prison this evening, not in the name of British justice, but in the name of British subservience to Washington. His only crime... His only crime, if it can be so called, is that he dared to say no. No to the high crimes and war crimes in the name of an empire, and no to the lies routinely deployed to try and justify those crimes. But Julian Assange did more than say no himself. In pulling back the flowery curtains of democracy and human rights, behind which the savage beast of hegemony and imperialism resides, he invited us all to say no. And given that empires thrive to the extent that its supposed beneficiaries, i.e. us, are willing to suspend disbelief, in pulling back those curtains, Julian Assange and WikiLeaks quickly became an existential threat to the ability of the empire to function as normal. And when an empire cannot function as normal, this threat is greater than 1,000,000 bayonets. Albert Camus reminds us that it is the job of thinking people not to side with the executioners. And since the demise of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, the executioners have been on the march, leading to the execution of Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, the putative execution of Syria, the putative execution of Cuba, the putative execution of Iran, the putative execution of Venezuela, and the putative execution of North Korea. Now, this is not to say that we exculpate those governments of everything they do, but it is to understand the inextricable relationship between a nation's internal development and the external pressure arrayed against it in any given space and time, and the inordinate pressure arrayed against those states by imperialism, economic, military, geopolitical, and cultural, is such that they find it hard to breathe, much less develop. Putting it another way, imagine if someone was to grab you round the throat right now. The immediate effect would be that you would not be able to breathe properly. But imagine they were to do so, then berate you at the same time for not being able to breathe properly. This is how imperialism and its lackeys operates in our time. Speaking of execution and executioners, the slow-motion execution of Julian Assange, make no mistake, this is a slow-motion execution, is taking place at the hands of an axis of mendacity, made up of the Swedish, British, US authorities, and most despicably of all, a mainstream media in the West, which does not operate on the basis of holding the powerful to account on behalf of the people, but instead on holding the people to account on behalf of the powerful. Now, those journalists who've been engaged in this campaign of demonisation, dehumanisation, and delegitimization of Julian Assange for such people, a special place in hell awaits. These are not journalists, these are ideological foot soldiers. In fact, they're not even ideological foot soldiers, they are expensively educated, fulminating cranks and hacks who have made lucrative careers out of defending the indefensible. You know who I mean. I'm talking about these Guardian quote-unquote progressives who, with a chai latte in one hand and a signed copy of Campbell's Diaries or Blair's autobiography in the other, step over homeless people in the street on the way to their hot yoga classes and their sushi bars, there to congratulate one another on the latest instalment of the vacuous tripe which they serve up to the god of yellow journalism. I will never forget the chill that slid down my spine as I watched the footage of Julian Assange being ripped from his asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy by a group of plainclothes policemen and thrown into the back of a van. That was an act of fascism. It was a glimpse of the future. It was a glimpse of the future unless we stand up and wake up to this inexorable slide towards this fascist, totalitarian corporate state that Chris Hedges talked about. There is no hiding place from this. We must stand up to what's taking place. We must stand with Julian Assange. When one man says no, Rome begins to fear. We must stand with him and say no together. George Orwell said that if you want a glimpse of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. Well, given what befell Julian Assange, we can amend that to say, if you want a glimpse of the future, imagine political dissidents and journalists being forced out of foreign embassies, thrown into the back of a van and sent into the void of the US justice system forever. And staying with Orwell, what better summation of Julian Assange's plight is there than his other famous formulation that in a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. And this indeed is a time of universal deceit. For example, deceit. The war in Iraq in 2003 was fought to destroy Saddam Hussein's stockpiles of WMD. Truth. Saddam Hussein in 2003 never had stockpiles of WMD. Deceit. Okay then, the war unleashed against Iraq in 2003 was to bring democracy to that country and by extension to the region and to topple a dictator who was killing and torturing his own people. Truth. This was a war for imperialism, to assert control over a country that sits on a sea of oil. It was not a war for democracy, and when it comes to Saddam Hussein torturing and killing his own people, the victims of his vile crimes are pale in comparison to the number of Iraqis who've been killed by the West over the last 30 or 40 years. I'm talking about the 13 years of sanctions between 1990 and 2003, responsible for the deaths of 2 million people, 500,000 of those children. En passant, Madeleine Albright, may you burn in hell. I'm talking about the million people. A million people who were killed as a direct result of the war in 2003, which did not, as I say, bring democracy, but pushed that country in an abyss of sectarian civil war, opening the gates of hell out of which the monster of ISIS emerged, the consequences of which we will be living for generations to come. Saddam Hussein in 2003 was a leader who'd announced that he was intending to dump the dollar, and he also held some fancy ideas about pan-Arabism. Deceit. The NATO intervention in Libya in 2011 was undertaken to protect civilian life. Truth. It was a NATO intervention with the objective of placing the West at the head of an Arab Spring that had taken it by surprise when it began in Tunisia and swept through to Egypt, to ensure that it landed on the rocks of Western hegemony. This revolt in Libya was not a popular revolt. It lacked mass support in order to get over the finish line on its own steam. The result in Libya is not democracy 8 years later, it is the grim reality of slave markets. And Muammar Gaddafi, in 2011, had announced plans to dump the dollar and replace it with a pan-African dinar, backed by Libyan gold reserves. Is anybody starting to discern a pattern here? Deceit. The crisis and conflict in Ukraine in 2013 is born of Russian aggression and expansionism. Truth. The crisis and conflict in Ukraine starting in 2013 was a result of a violent coup in Kiev which toppled the country's elected government as per that country's constitution. In the vanguard of this coup were open Nazis and fascists. This was supported by the West with the objective of effecting the eastward expansion of NATO in violation of agreements that were made during the negotiations that brought an end to the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, using Kiev as a cat's paw. Deceit. Crimea was annexed in 2013. Truth. Crimea was liberated in 2013. Deceit. Juan Guaido is representative of the forces of democracy in Caracas. Truth. Juan Guaido is representative of the forces of hegemony in Washington, whose every statement and speech should be made sitting on John Bolton's lap. Finally, deceit. Western governments operate on the basis of democracy at home and human rights abroad. Truth. Western governments operate on the basis of class oppression at home and imperialism abroad. Julian Assange should not be on trial, but he should have been sent to Sweden many years ago, there to pick up his Nobel Prize alongside Chelsea and Manning. Julian Assange should not be on trial, but he does belong in court. There is a principal witness in the trials of George W. Bush and Tony Blair for crimes against humanity and war crimes. The trials of David Cameron, Nicolas Sarkozy, and Barack Obama for the destruction of Libya. The trial of Hillary Rodham Clinton for, well, just for being Hillary Clinton, for corruption and for accepting bribes from foreign governments through her rank-rotten Clinton Foundation, and of course a principal witness in the trials of those American barbarians who were recorded whooping and hollering with delight as they massacred a group of civilians in Iraq in an Apache helicopter. Speaking of which, I need to make a quick detour to counter a claim that's often levelled against me that I am somehow anti-American. Oh, I really am. Why are you always attacking America? Why are you so anti-American? And when I do encounter this claim, I always offer the same simple response, which is, how is it possible to be anti the land that produced Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull? The land that produced Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, John Brown, the land that produced Mother Jones, the land that produced Eugene Debs, the land that produced Big Bill Haywood and the Wobblies, the land that produced the Haymarket Martyrs, the land that produced the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, Woody Guthrie, Paul Robeson, Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X, the Black Panther Party, Martin Luther King and the Black Civil Rights Movement, the Anti-Vietnam War Movement, the land that produced John Steinbeck, Arthur Miller, the land that produced James Baldwin, the land that produced Marvin Gaye, the land that produced Leonard Peltier, Mumia Abu-Jamal, the land that produced Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, and yes, the land that produced Chris Hedges. No, I'm not anti-American, I'm just anti-your-America.
Yes.
Friends, empires are sustained by the force of their idea more than the idea of their force. And when the idea is no longer enough to sustain them, and force is what they're reduced to deploying in order to maintain their power, nothing but nothing can halt their decline. Thus, today we are witnessing an empire that is in decline, and in decline it has entered its mad dog days, adopting bellicose language, belligerency, and using hard power instead of diplomacy as its preferred weapon of sustaining its power. Donald Trump is no aberration. He is not an aberration from the business as normal as his liberal detractors would have us believe. He is America with its mask removed. Yes. The white supremacy, the vulgar capitalism, the rampant individualism. He is the leader that that country deserves and the leader that that media deserves, which has done its best to keep the American people swimming in a sea of false consciousness. As I say, the scale of the injustice being levelled against Julian Assange is enormous. Therefore, so must our resistance to that injustice also be. Every meeting held, every social media posted in solidarity with Julian Assange. Every comment made, every article written is all a brick in the wall of resistance. This is a campaign that can be won, it's a campaign that must be won. As Jose Marti, the great Cuban revolutionary thinker and patriot, said at the end of the 19th century, referring to the United States, "I have lived inside the monster and I know its entrails, and my sling is David's." We today are living inside the same monster. Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning have shown us its entrails, and it's time to reach for our slings. Because in the last analysis, it's really very simple. Until Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning are free, none of us are. Thank you.